Well, I used to call politics in BC wacky. It's settled down over time, but the latest election result has put it back front and center in the national debate. An agreement between the NDP and the Greens likely means the end of the Christy Liberal government. But it's complicated and could impact some major decisions in Ottawa. Chantel's in Montreal tonight, Andrew's here in Toronto, and Paul Wells is in Ottawa. But we're going to start tonight in Vancouver with our friend Shachi Kurl, the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. We asked her to give us the three things we need to know about the unfolding political drama in BC.
One, it's going to be all eyes on the BC legislature in the coming weeks. To recap, the Greens and the NDP have signed a 4-year agreement to support each other. Meantime, BC Liberal Premier Christy Clark, and yes, she is still Premier, isn't quitting. She wants to test her government's confidence in the House, and that may well pave the way for that Green-NDP alliance, or it may not. There is a lot of procedural wrangling to come. The first thing is that the House needs to pick a speaker, and there are strategic reasons why all three parties may not be very keen to put one of their own members forward for that to happen. And if they don't, if the House can't come to an agreement, well, British Columbians could be going back to the polls. Two, provided BC does get a functioning government, look for major implications on the national energy file. Following their voters, the NDP and Green leaders have said that they're going to do everything they can, including use the courts, to block the expansion and twinning of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline. One province over in Alberta, this has left Premier Rachel Notley fuming, especially as Albertans who are still trying to get back up on their feet economically worry about how they're going to get their oil to market. So get ready for a big fight, one that puts Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in a very awkward position. Remember, he's burned a lot of political capital by saying yes to this project. And so far, he's doubled down, saying it will go ahead and he continues to support it. But we have seen in cases where Trudeau has backed away from politically unpopular decisions. Remember that deadline on refugee resettlement that was moved? Or remember that promise, one that he was very stringent on, about electoral reform, one that ended up being broken. 3, speaking of electoral reform, it may well be Victoria, not Ottawa, that leads the way in how voters elect their governments. Green leader Andrew Weaver has been explicit in saying he wants British Columbia to be the test case to show that multi-party governments can work. But what kind of system? What kind of reform will British Columbians have a say? The answer is yes, by way of a referendum next year, provided the alliance holds. Which brings us all back to the coming weeks. Keep your eyes trained west, folks. This thing has more layers than an onion, and I'll be watching as they get peeled back one by one.
All right, Shachi, thanks very much. There's lots there for us to chew on in terms of national implications, and especially for Justin Trudeau. Andrew, where do you start on that?
Well, before we get to the national implications, there is still this matter of how does this actually get resolved in BC? Sachi laid out very well the particular issue about the speaker and the impasse that could be resolved there and possible elections that come from that. But even if they can get past that, a government in which you have two sides that essentially have the same number of seats with the speaker to break ties, that is not a stable situation. That is not a government that is going to be able to make large decisions. The speaker, for example, is not supposed to vote to make those kinds of changes. He's supposed to vote in favor of the status quo if he has to break a tie. So it's an inherently unstable situation, and I think you can see that in the way that Christy Clark is playing her cards, that even if she does get defeated in the short term, it doesn't necessarily mean that this fabled 4-year agreement is going to take any effect. So all of that still has to be worked through before we get on to this question of what does it mean in terms of the Kinder Morgan file, what does it mean in terms of the proportional representation, et cetera.
Well, let's move it to Kinder Morgan first. Chantel, I mean, should we assume it's dead or what?
that would be premature, but if you take away all this procedural stuff, you are still left with some stark political realities. And one of those is that the vast majority, a significant majority of BC voters, mostly located in areas where the federal Liberals have seat, voted for parties that do not want Kinder Morgan to go through. These are people who voted most likely for Justin Trudeau in the last election. So that's the politics of it, regardless of the outcome. Whoever gets to run this legislature in Victoria is not going to want to die on a hill defending Kinder Morgan. I'm speaking here of Premier Clark. Why would she? This is where she lost her seats on ground zero of the pipeline debate. So at the end of the day, net result, the opponents to the pipeline have been emboldened, to say the least, and the federal government, who thought they had kind of a tentative path forward, cannot take that for granted anymore.
Nothing good in this situation for Justin Trudeau, Paul.
Well, I mean, I'm not so sure. He gets to demonstrate through purifying sacrifice that he means it when he's on Rachel Notley's side of this fight. That'll probably make him a little bit more popular, not only in Alberta but in different resource-producing regions of the country. And I don't think there's a huge cost to be paid in British Columbia for pursuing with the line that he has already announced and is known in British Columbia that he supports this pipeline. My understanding is that the federal government's the federal government's power to approve this pipeline is not subject to provincial second guessing. Lord knows in this country a court might decide differently, but then Trudeau would have someone to blame, and it would be sort of out of his hands.
Well, you do wonder, though, does he really need an ugly fight that could end up in the courts with a province on an issue like a pipeline? Andrew?
Well, British Columbia opinion is divided. There's certainly, you would say, a majority might be against it, but it doesn't mean the unanimous by any means. And while we're all talking about how hot opinion is in BC, there's equally hot opinion in Alberta on this. If Albertans are going to be told, sorry, no, we're not a country, we're not an economic union, we're not guaranteeing the free flow of goods through the whole of Canada, we don't have a federal government that's supposed to protect the jurisdiction that crosses interprovincial boundaries. If all of that is told to Albertans, you're just basically landlocked, there's going to be hell to pay in Alberta. Conversely, if there is a big fight, and if Trudeau digs in his heels, and if he gets the thing built, that is potentially realigning in terms of how Albertans and Saskatchewan voters look at the Liberals. They have traditionally, for 50, 60 years, not been terribly interested in the Liberals. But that's the kind of thing that can get people to look at them in a very different way.
Chantal?
Yes, but maybe. The fact is that you don't need unanimity to be against a pipeline. You need to look at where the people who are against it are located. And you do have MPs, 17 of them in that caucus. Too many of them in the Liberal caucus federally are located in areas where people do not want the pipeline. I'm not so sure that Trudeau is willing to trade possible interest in Saskatchewan and Alberta for actual seats in BC. And three, it's not just the courts that can get in the way of Trudeau's approval of this pipeline. It's also the provincial government by refusing provincial permits or the municipal permits for all kinds of things that are related to the expansion of the pipeline. So it's a lot more complicated than just going to court and landing on a bad judge from the federal perspective.
All right. I want to move it to the other one of the other big stories of the week, but it's certainly the week started with the new leader of the Conservative Party. Here's what he said to his caucus on Monday.
We're the party of everyday Canadians who work hard, who make sacrifices to secure a better future for their kids. That's who we are. That's who we fight for. We're never going to change. The Liberals can take their cues from the cocktail circuit. We will take ours from the minivans, from the soccer fields, the Legion halls, and the grocery stores.
Andrew Scheer, the new leader of the Conservative Party. Paul, you wrote a big piece that just come out in Maclean's, and analyzing that decision last week. We've all had this opportunity now, spent almost a week thinking about what happened there and the implications of it. What is your overall take on what happened last week and why it matters?
Andrew Scheer is a nice guy, and that counted for more than a little in this race because the Conservative Party was due for one. But he also won essentially by playing rope-a-dope for more than a decade as Deputy Speaker and then as Speaker of the House of Commons, ostentatiously nonpartisan, and then by being careful not to make enemies in a long, year-long leadership race in which a bunch of his colleagues weren't as careful. So in the end, when it came down to a choice between Max Bernier and somebody else, he was the somebody. The test for, and being nice means he'll be a tougher target than Bernier would have been to attack. He will be incongruously appealing compared to some of the ways the Liberals are going to try to frame him. The test is whether he can be bold. The question is whether he can be bold. Stephen Harper came to power by proposing a GST cut that every economist in the country said was nutty and that had no history in conservative lore. Justin Trudeau came to power in part through proposing a return to deficits when, again, the conventional wisdom said that wasn't very smart. It's not clear whether Andrew Scheer has that kind of hairpin turns built into his psyche. He's never really had a chance to demonstrate that.
The other way those two came to power was a throw the bums out attitude on the part of the public for the party in power at that time. And the question will be, will that exist next time round with Trudeau versus Scheer? Chantal, your take on this?
It's also, in the case of Stephen Harper, that it took him 2 elections at the tail end of a decade of Liberal rule, and in the case of Justin Trudeau, that he didn't need to be introduced or framed by the other parties because a lot of Canadians felt that they knew who he was. Andrew Scheer's first challenge, I think, is going to have to be to introduce himself to Canadians. And the longer he takes to do that, the more the other parties will get a chance to frame who he is to Canadians. And because he is a blank slate, you look at the numbers, I mean, 85% in Quebec, 80% in Ontario who have no idea really who he is. The longer he takes to make an impression, the more they will get to define it for him.
You know, the Liberals, like a lot of other people, thought Bernier was going to win. They had all those buttons and various other things printed up to showcase at the convention and also kind of pass around the country. Andrew, should the Liberals be worried about Andrew Scheer?
Potentially. It's hard to say at this point, but he was, I think, probably the least risky choice. He has, I think, less upside than Bernier might have had, but less downside as well. So we're going to have to see how that develops. But he's at the helm, I think, of a very different party in many ways than in the past. We looked at that 51-49 vote, and it's easy to say, well, the party is split, and think of it in sort of binary terms as sort of a pro-Harper, anti-Harper type of vote. I think it's much more complicated than that. Scheer would not have won if he was just the steady-as-she-goes moderate candidate, and he wouldn't have won if he was just the social conservative candidate. He was the guy who could kind of straddle that divide. But those are two very different camps. And I think what we're going to see is Harper kind of bestrode that party as its first leader and you know, squashed all kinds of internal dissent or differing expressions of opinion. But we just had this long race where all the different factions within the party got to strut their stuff. Bernier leading, of course, the free market faction, getting 49% of the vote from various sources, but also the SOCONs, also the progressive conservatives. I don't think it's going to be as easy for him to kind of just put all that back into the can now. I think he's going to be a much more traditional leader who has to kind of work between these different factions rather than just simply squashing them with an iron fist.
And Harper had an advantage that he won't have, and it was that Quebec was voting for parties in opposition. At this point, they're back in the Liberal fold, and unless he can compete with Trudeau in Quebec, it's going to be very hard to replicate that 2011 Conservative majority without Quebec, because Quebec is not going back to the Bloc. And I think the next leader of the NDP won't have as much traction here as Thomas Mulcair had.
All right, Paul, you get the last word. I've got 30 seconds left. The biggest challenge facing Scheer?
Surviving probable defeat. The other guys are right. There have been 2 prime ministers in history who got elected with a majority on their first try and then defeated the next time out. Alexander Mackenzie and R.B. Bennett. And incidentally, both of them were defeated by the PM that they had replaced. Sir John A. Macdonald came back to whack Mackenzie, and Mackenzie King came back to beat Bennett. Andrew Scheer is going to try and do the impossible, which is to beat a Trudeau on that Trudeau's second turn at bat. What he needs, he can't say that he's preparing for defeat, but he needs Conservatives to say to themselves, don't get too frisky. This might be a decade-long enterprise.
All right. We'll leave it at that. Great to have you with us again, Paul.
Thank you.
Chantal in Montreal, Andrew here in Toronto.